My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the great pleasure of serving as Director of Operations and Scholarship for the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. While we're still using this virtual platform to engage with you, our audience in all parts of the country and in some cases around the world, we love that we can still interact through the question and answer feature, which enables you to pose content-based questions to our phenomenal speaker today, Mr. Steven Waldman. So during the course of today's presentation, if you have any questions for him, you can put them into the Q&A section of the webinar. That looks like two speech bubbles, either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what sort of device you're using to join us today. Now, if at any point you feel like you're having difficulty hearing us or seeing us, you need some technical troubleshooting, you can put those matters into the chat section of the webinar. I'll be keeping an eye on that and answering in real time. So once again, any content questions from Mr. Waldman can go into the Q&A. Any troubleshooting can go into the chat. It's now also my great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society to start today's program, Ms. Jane Campbell. Jane?
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much for doing all of the organization to make these happen. We really appreciate the work of you and Yanni Varanis, our communications director, to bring great speakers, and you to make sure that the technology works so that people can actually hear and see what's going on. This session today is part of our year-long series on the United States Constitution and its amendments. We began with a discussion about the Constitutional Convention and the deliberations about how to adopt a constitution and how to establish it in a manner that you would be able to amend it with a complex but doable process. The first body of amendments was what we now know as the Bill of Rights. And so today, we thought it was appropriate, as we are in a confluence with Holy Week, with the celebration of Passover, with the celebration of Ramadan, all coming at the same time, that in our complex and pluralistic society, many people are exercising their faith. And so today's speaker, Steven Waldman, is very perfect to address the First Amendment and religious liberty. Steve Waldman has given me permission to call him Steve, so I want you to know I'm not stepping out of my bounds. I have permission. He is the president and co-founder of the Report for America, which is a national service program that places reporters into local newsrooms to report on undercovered communities and issues. This program now places 325 reporters into 220 local newsrooms. And we know for our democracy that having reporters in local communities is important. Steve is the author of the national bestseller, Founding Faith: How Our Founding Fathers Forged a Radical New Approach to Religious Liberty. You can see this. It is totally worth getting. It's very readable, it's fascinating, and I am sure that after you listen to Steve, you will want to read the book. And its sequel, which I have not read, but I'm interested in reading, called Sacred Liberty: America's Long, Bloody, and Ongoing Fight for Religious Freedom. Sacred Liberty won the Wilbur Award for the best nonfiction book on religion and was a finalist for the best nonfiction religion book of 2019 from Religion News Association. Earlier, he founded and ran BeliefNet, a leading content website of the web in the 1.0 era. It became the largest religion and spirituality site and won the National Magazine Award for General Excellence Online. Previously, he'd been a reporter for Newsweek, editor for U.S. News and World Report, and his writings have appeared in all manner of national publications, both religious and secular. He serves on the board of the Interfaith Center of New York, the Religious News Service, Washington Monthly, and the Columbia Spectator. He lives in Brooklyn, and we're glad he's healthy and well with all that's gone on in Brooklyn, together with his wife, Amy Cunningham. So, Stephen, tell us about the First Amendment and religious liberty. What did the founders mean, and what does it mean for today?
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This is an honor to speak with you and your community. The other context, in addition to Easter and Passover and Ramadan, is we're in a global conflict in some ways between freedom and authoritarianism. And so the fact that America's approach to religious freedom has been so successful, relatively speaking, is really important. I would actually say that America's approach to religious freedom is America's greatest invention. This is, it is not the case for most countries and most people in the history of the world that they have been able to live in religiously free societies. And in fact, 3/4 of the current world population are not living in religiously free societies, including the Jehovah's Witnesses that are routinely imprisoned in Russia right now, or the Muslim minority in China. And I would even say Muslims in France that are told to take off their bikinis on the beach because it violates the secularism rules of France. Most countries throughout world history have not gotten this right. And yet we have I'd say, gotten the closest, have the best model. And, a lot of different things you could point to. My favorite moment, I guess, recently was in 2016 when the United States Supreme Court began its session by seating 6 Catholic justices and 3 Jewish justices. So these are men and women who would not have been allowed to hold office in early America, and now they were the entire composition of the Supreme Court. It's another way of looking at this. Part of why I think it's been so successful is it's not just a matter of secularism. America also has a high degree of religiosity, religious practice. There's this wonderful chart that the Pew Research Center did once where they mapped religious practice and wealth. And usually as countries get wealthier, their religious practice goes down, and as they're poorer, religious practice goes up. And then on this chart, there's this one little dot off in the upper right with no other countries around it. That's the United States, that is both affluent and religious. And we really know very little about how we got religious freedom. Part of my message is going to be that the First Amendment is really only part of the story. It's obviously a very important part of the story, but I want to tell you a little bit about what came before and after that led us to where we are today. So I'm going to start by talking about sort of the first 150 years, which I would say is a failed experiment in how to do religion and the state. America was not settled as a refuge for religious freedom. It was mostly settled by folks who wanted to create religiously homogeneous communities. Richard Mather, one of the early Puritans, said that his motives for coming to the New World was the opportunity to censure those who ought to be censured. And Increase Mather and other Puritan leaders said that toleration of all religion and persuasions is the way to have no religion at all. During that time, it was illegal, for instance, to be a Quaker. The punishment for being a Quaker was a whipping on the first offense, having your ear cut off on the second, and execution on the third. And in fact, 4 Quakers were hanged by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for the crime of being a Quaker. And that stemmed throughout the 1600s into the 1700s. Most of the colonies had official state religions. In the southern states, it was Anglicanism, and in New England, it tended to be the congregational establishments. So in some ways, the first 150 years can be viewed as a kind of series of failed experiments. Now, these experiments were not unusual. They were basically doing it the way other countries throughout the world had been doing it through most of history. There was just this notion that if you thought religion was important, the government should support it. And that's the way it was. So what the United States developed was really quite a radical new concept and a pivot. I would say the pivot actually started with the American Revolution itself, because it forced the founders to really confront a new approach, create a new national identity. Keep in mind that at the point of the revolution, only 13 of the colonies, only 3 of the 13 colonies allowed Catholics to vote, just as an example. We did not have religious freedom in the colonies. But you started to see, and George Washington was really a key player in this, as other things, the creation of the Continental Army and the Congress were these 2 national institutions that had to suddenly grapple with what it meant to have different religions. As an example, it was really common in the colonies to celebrate Pope Day by burning effigies of the Pope. It's hard to overstate how much of the early, American settling impulse was to fight Catholicism. And yet the Washington and the colonists were trying to engage France as an ally, and Quebec and Canada. So one of the first things Washington did was to ban the burning of effigies of the Pope. He said, at this juncture, in these circumstances, to be insulting to their religion is so monstrous that it cannot be excused. And for a lot of these people, this is the first time they were working with other, folks from different religions. The army included Baptists from Rhode Island and Dutch Reformed from New York and Congregationalists from Connecticut and even Catholics from Maryland. And they were fighting side by side, and houses of worship of different sorts were often helping to feed and care the soldiers. And so the creation of the army itself and the leadership of Washington started to forge a different approach. Continental Congress went through a kind of identity crisis about this. When they first started, they were passing resolutions that were anti-Catholic, and then by the end they were saying, we are believers in religious freedom, and their whole attitude changed. So let's talk about Madison, James Madison, who I think is really the key figure if you have to pick one person. He was sort of the Zelig of religious freedom in early American history. He laid the groundwork for religious freedom in Virginia. He then got the statute for religious freedom passed. He then got the Constitution crafted, or was instrumental, and then he chaperoned the Bill of Rights. There was a really interesting moment that kind of gets a little bit at what Madison's approach to this was. There was a bill that was proposed by Patrick Henry in Virginia after the Revolution that was basically going to help provide extra funds for churches. And it wasn't like one of the establishments where you had to pick a particular religion the way they had in Virginia. It enabled you to choose which church you wanted to get a government subsidy from. And so it had a lot of support. George Washington supported it, Patrick Henry supported it. Madison opposed it vehemently. And his argument was that even efforts to help religion would backfire. And interestingly, his allies in this were the evangelical Christians of Virginia, the Baptists, who teamed up with him. And you had this kind of interesting alliance between the Enlightenment thinkers like Madison and Jefferson and what we would now call the evangelical Christians of that era. And they worked together to block this bill on the grounds that even efforts to help religion would hurt religion. It would make people think that religion is a puppet of the state. It would make clergy lazy by making them not have to sort of fight for their congregants. And it really, and they succeeded. And shortly after that, they passed the statute of religious freedom that Jefferson wrote and got the credit for, but he was actually off in France, and it was Madison that plucked it from the pile of kind of moribund bills and got that passed as well. So Madison's philosophy here is he actually would talk contemptuously about what he called parchment barriers, meaning bills of rights. It was interesting, given the importance of Bill of Rights and how much we associated with Madison, that he was kind of skeptical about how much power a set of words could have. He actually thought that the more important way to guarantee religious freedom was what he called having a multiplicity of sects, different denominations all jostling for followers. Essentially what we all read about, in college about his approach in the Federalist Papers to having checks and balances and a pluralistic marketplace of political power. He also believed that for religion, and that if you had a free marketplace of faiths, no one religion would dominate. And so he kind of thought that was as important as whatever the words were. And part of how he got to this was experience that he had in Virginia in the early 1770s. This would be right when he came back from college. So he's like a 22-year-old. And we often think of Madison as showing up at the Constitutional Convention with, his books, having studied the different classical systems and ways of constructing republics. But there was something else that had happened to him that doesn't get nearly enough attention that I think was just as profound, at least when we're talking about religious freedom, which is that area of Virginia, like literally right around his house, was an area of massive persecution of Baptists in the late 1760s and early 1770s. There's all sorts of amazing examples. There's Reverend John Waller was preaching in Caroline County in 1771 when an Anglican minister walked up to the pulpit, jammed the butt end of a horsewhip into his mouth, dragged him outside and beat him up, and then imprisoned him for 113 days. Reverend James Ireland, another minister right in that area in Culpeper County, was arrested, continued to preach through the prison windows. And the Anglican church leaders, the leaders of the religious order there, galloped horses through the crowd, and hecklers stood on benches and urinated in James Ireland's face. Reverend David Thomas's worship services were disrupted by protesters who threw live snakes and hornets' nests. And during this period, there were 150 major attacks on Baptists during this period between 1760 and 1778. Many of them carried out by the leaders of the Anglican Church, and many of them right near Madison. And he became aware of this. He wrote to his friend, "This vexes me the most of anything." He was talking about 5 or 6 people who were at that moment imprisoned in the neighboring county just for publishing their religious sentiments. He said, "That diabolical, hell-conceived principle of persecution rages." So this was not an abstraction for Madison. He vividly understood what happened right in that area with persecution. And it wasn't just the violent persecution, it was also the fact that they had to register with the state. And it was even kind of more moderate forms of co-optation that he came to really hate. So when he was fighting against that bill that I mentioned in Virginia, he really started to articulate a radically different approach. He said government should be not involved in this at all, not even to help. Religion, he said, should be wholly exempt from its cognizance. It's amazing, we talk about separation of church and state. This is even more dramatic than that. He just thought religion should be off limits to the mind of the government. Now, as I said, he was actually skeptical of Bill of Rights. He thought, these parchment barriers didn't do much. He thought checks and balances were going to be more important. But he had a political problem, which is that first of all, they needed to get the Constitution ratified. And then subsequent to that, he needed to get elected to Congress. And in both cases, he was being told that his allies, the Baptists, were losing confidence in him because they wanted a Bill of Rights. They thought it was really untenable that the Constitution didn't offer any religious freedom guarantees. And so he flip-flops and essentially makes, one of the most important campaign promises in American history. He basically says, if you elect me, I will propose a Bill of Rights. And so he does. He is elected to the House. He proposes language. The ultimate version is Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The interesting thing about this, there was all sorts of different versions of this. This didn't just go right from Madison's pen to the, to the National Archives. This was the product of a political process. Madison proposed another amendment, which was that Congress had the ability to veto state laws. And that was because he thought, especially in the area of religious freedom, that the threat was going to come from the states. And the significant thing about this is that Madison lost on that. He didn't get that. It's an important bit of context to understand as you're reading the debates about the First Amendment, because you will have these debates, everyone's talking about religious freedom, and then you'll have these comments like Benjamin Huntington from Connecticut. He said, I like this, this amendment, but I fear that it's actually going to be harmful to the cause of religion, extremely harmful to the cause of religion. Why would the First Amendment, which we now view as the ultimate guarantor of freedom of religion, be harmful to the cause of religion? And what Huntington meant was, hey, in Connecticut, we actually have a state establishment. We use tax dollars to help support the salaries of the ministers in Connecticut. And we want to keep doing that. And we don't want this First Amendment to knock out our establishment. And this must have been a very painful compromise for Madison because he really hated that. But he wasn't just a founding father. He didn't think of himself, he was a politician, and he was counting votes as well as writing language. And he understood that in order to get this passed, he had to reassure them that, no, this First Amendment, it's really just about the federal government. All it does is limit the federal government. You states can continue to do whatever you want. So it's kind of a myth to think that the First Amendment was passed, that the founding fathers wanted it to impose separation of church and state throughout the land. They didn't. I mean, Madison would have preferred to, honestly, but as a collective, that's not what the First Amendment did. The First Amendment guaranteed religious liberty and a separation of church and state at the federal level. So that was what the nation had when the First Amendment was ratified. It was really a states' rights compromise. And in fact, states were free to continue to regulate religion, have state religions, do mostly whatever they wanted within the confines of their own state constitutions and laws. And so what you had after the ratification, and this is why I said that, the real story of religious freedom doesn't end with the ratification of the First Amendment. That's kind of the middle of the story. You then had another 20 or 30 years where there's sort of the themes of religious freedom. These new themes do start to permeate on the state level, and kind of state by state, different states are knocking out their state establishments and starting to impose some of these ideas. But still, it's, as I'll discuss in the next few minutes, the fight over religious freedom continued onward. One nice kind of fluke of history is that 4 of the key people who were involved in defining what religious liberty meant became president in sequence. So we actually got to see in real terms what they thought the First Amendment meant. You think that would be clarifying, right? Not so much, because it turns out that Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison disagreed with each other over what those words that they just passed actually meant. So you'd have Washington and Adams. Adams, for instance, did prayer proclamations from the White House that were very Christian, that was pretty much like the, like a state religion would. And then Jefferson comes in and says, that's horrible. That's not what the First Amendment means. We should not have prayer proclamations. And it's worth just pausing for a moment on Jefferson. I've talked a lot about Madison because I think he really is the key figure here. But Jefferson, of course, is also associated with religious freedom, and is just a very interesting character here because he kind of points out that in the modern culture wars, we kind of tend to think like the people who are very religious are the ones who want separation of church and state, and the people who are who oppose separation of church and state, who want more mingling, and the secular people are the ones who want more separation. And that wasn't really the way it worked. Like, as I said before, the evangelical Christians were the biggest advocates for separation of church and state, and they were allies with Jefferson. Even though in his election, Jefferson is accused by Adams of being a heretic. There's a big ad that says, we have a choice, a continued allegiance to God and a religious president, or Jefferson and no God. They were really hitting hard on the idea that Jefferson was a heretic. So Jefferson's personal spiritual life is really interesting. And, if you read the totality of what he's writing, he pretty much hates organized religion. He thinks Christianity was ruined from almost the start. The quote, "But a short time elapsed after the death of the great reformer of the Jewish religion, Jesus, before his principles were departed from by those who professed to be his special servants and perverted into an engine for enslaving mankind and aggrandizing their oppressors in the church and state." He said the authors of the Gospels were ignorant, unlettered men who laid a groundwork of vulgar ignorance of things impossible, superstitions, fabrications. The Trinity was a abracadabra of the mountebanks, calling themselves the priests of Jesus. And then the Protestant Reformation, he said, just made it worse. John Calvin and the idea of predestination, he said that he should be put in a straitjacket. So meanwhile, Jefferson as president decides that as a hobby on the side, he's going to make his own Bible. And he sits there with a knife and has 4 different Bibles in different languages, and he's cutting out the parts of the Bible that he agrees with. And basically he's cutting out the miracles and divine intervention and turning it into a set of moral teachings. Now, you might come away from this thinking he's anti-Jesus or anti-spirituality, and that's not true either. I mean, you read these letters about why he's doing this, and you get the sense that he wants to rescue Jesus. He's doing this in the way that a parent would who's trying to rescue a child or something like that. He thinks that Christianity has distorted and ruined this spiritual leader that actually Jefferson loves. And it's when you think about it, part of why Jefferson cared so much about religious freedom is he really wanted to banish the notion of heresy. In part because he was a heretic by those standards. He wanted to have his own spiritual journey that was unencumbered, and that's what he wanted for other people. Now, as we move forward in time, it becomes clear in the 19th century that there's a lot of work to be done. There are so many elements of religious freedom not being actually manifest. To some degree, when you're looking at the 19th century and early 20th century, a lot of it is anti-Catholic. I mean, it's really interesting when you get into the full history, how much of the story of religious freedom is America getting over its hatred of Catholics and getting past its anti-Catholicism, which was just absolutely pervasive among the founding fathers and beyond. Even before there were all that many Catholics, they, to some degree, came to the New World in part to fight Catholicism. And then in the 1800s, as you started to have Catholic immigration, it got worse. In 1832, a mob burns down a convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts. A couple years later, there are riots in which 30 people are killed in Philadelphia, called the Bible riots, because they grew up over the Catholics objected that the Protestants were insisting on teaching only the Protestant Bible in the Philadelphia schools. The Catholics didn't object to their teaching the Bible, but they said, this is not fair. That's not the Bible we subscribe to. and there were riots and, hundreds of Catholic families loading up their wagons to leave Philadelphia because they felt like they could not have religious freedom. And as you moved into the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan, the second Klan, emerges. And in addition to their racism, they add another key part of their ideology, which is anti-Catholicism. It actually becomes equally important to their racism is their opposition to Catholics. They become hugely powerful. They have effective political control in Indiana and Ohio. The Klan-backed candidates win the governorships of Oregon, Colorado, Indiana, Kansas. Massive marches of the US Capitol. At the Democratic Convention in 1924, the Klan had 343 delegates that were influenced by the Klan. And so when in 1928, Al Smith, a Catholic, becomes the nominee, it was the biggest outpouring in a public sense of anti-Catholic sentiment. At the Democratic Convention, an effigy of Smith is brought into the hall, its throat is slit, fake blood comes out. Throughout that campaign, he is depicted as the Pope's puppet. Klansmen actually claimed that a photo of the recently completed Holland Tunnel in New York was actually a secret pathway from the United States to Rome, through which the Pope would arrive and take over the country. So you have the attacks on Catholics, then you have the attacks on Mormons. And this is brutal. In Missouri, the governor of Missouri in 1838 issues an official executive order calling for the extermination of the Mormons. And a few days later, there is one of the biggest mass killings related to religious freedom in American history. About 250 Missourians, including a state senator and other notables, arrived at a community in Missouri called Haun's Mill. They rode their horses forward, assembled in a line about 75 yards away from the community of Mormons there, and opened fire. And they are tracking people down. There's a famous case of they go into another room, they find a 10-year-old boy, and the soldier puts a gun to his head and blows his head off. And when one of the other soldiers complains about it or raises a question, he said, "Nits make lice," meaning you've got to kill all the Mormon children or else they're going to turn into adult Mormons. 17 Mormons were killed just in that day. And the persecution of Mormons went on and on and on. President James Buchanan dispatched the army, 1,200 soldiers to subdue the Mormons once they had moved out into Salt Lake City, into Utah. And in the later years, a lot of the conflict had to do with their practice of polygamy. But Congress, when they tried to stamp out polygamy, they didn't just stamp out polygamy. They said, well, we also have to stamp out the Mormon Church because they're the ones doing this. So they actually passed laws disincorporating the Church of Latter-day Saints. And from 1882 to 1896, 1,400 Mormons were indicted. Nearly 1,000 Mormons were jailed, including their members of Congress, over these crimes. During this same period, the persecution of the religious lives of Native Americans was brutal. Now, so much was brutal about our approach to Native Americans, we often forget this part. But there was this weird period after the Civil War where the good guys were the people who wanted to not annihilate the Native Americans' lives, but wanted to merely eliminate their religion and Christianize them. And they did this in a few ways. One was with the boarding schools that I'm sure you're familiar with. The boarding schools, in addition to wiping out culture, were designed to wipe out their religion. It was Christian, in some cases Protestant, in some cases Catholic, Christian upbringing to wipe out the spirituality of Native Americans. Very deliberate, very intentional. So think about that. I mean, that was the official policy of the US government, to wipe out the religion of a whole population of people. The instruction was in Christianity. when the children died, as many of them did, they were buried in the cemeteries of these schools, were given Christian burials. There was great pride at the Indian Affairs Office about their success and how they were purging the Native American spirituality. And then in addition to that, in 1883, the government banned dances, Indian dances, which were really important parts of their spiritual lives. And that became illegal. They banned medicine men, who were really important spiritual players, and they banned the Indian mourning ritual in which families would destroy property of the deceased as part of the grieving process. And even to some extent, the taking of Indian land, although it obviously was primarily driven by other things, there was an awareness from some of the architects of this that it also would have the added benefit of destroying Native American religion. John Wesley Powell, who the explorer who later became the head of the Smithsonian Institution's part of it, said that the government should try to make it a point to shatter the Indians' attachment to their sacred homeland. Quote, when an Indian clan or tribe gives up its land, it not only surrenders its home, as understood by civilized people, but its gods are abandoned, and all its religion connected therewith are also destroyed, which he viewed as a benefit. And then finally, in the same category is enslaved Americans, where their deprivation of freedoms was so complete that we don't think about the religious freedom part of this, but that was total as well. And historians will sometimes debate to what extent slaves were practicing Christianity or not, but of course that skips a step, which is they had a whole other religious and spiritual system when they were kidnapped and brought over here. In some cases it was Islam, in some cases it was African religions, and those were wiped out. In other parts of the world, by the way, their religions, for reasons of having to do with the size of plantations and things like that, the religion sometimes survived, but not in America. The historian John Butler said that slaves experienced a spiritual holocaust that effectively destroyed traditional African religion systems. And Albert Rabateau, who's one of the preeminent scholars of slave religion, said that while some African religious traditions persisted more in Haiti and Brazil and Cuba, other places where they were enslaved, quote, in the United States, the gods of Africa died. So throughout the 19th century, we see that religious freedom is not real for many different populations of America. We still have a long way to go to make this First Amendment be anything like what it is today. Now, the next key moment is the passage of the 14th Amendment. That is the amendment that essentially provides that many of the benefits of the First Amendment or the Bill of Rights would be applied to the states as well. And John Bingham, who really should be equally considered a founding father, was himself an evangelical Christian and quite motivated by the desire to guarantee freedom of conscience on the local level and not just on the federal level. And so the passage of the 14th Amendment doesn't immediately have this impact, but over the next 75 years it does, through a variety of court cases. The two other things that I think are worth mentioning as we get to the modern era. One is World War II. I think World War II actually played a critical role in changing our ideas about religious freedom. You started to see the interfaith movement. There were these things called tolerance trios, which was essentially a rabbi, a minister, and a priest went around giving speeches, thousands of meetings all across the country in the 30s to promote interfaith understanding and tolerance. Then you had Roosevelt, who, as part of pitching the obligation to support Great Britain, this is before we got into the war, but we were trying to build up support for Great Britain, we have the four freedoms. And he creates his own list of freedom of speech and expression, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And the fourth one is the freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. He makes it a cause, a war aim. And his explanation is interesting. He said, when he's talking to a bunch of reporters, he said, you need to have this because religion, by teaching man his relationship to God, gives the individual a sense of his own dignity and teaches him to respect himself by respecting his neighbors. It's a very interesting explanation of why he's doing this. But it's also a way of unifying the country and contrasting us with the Nazis. When Truman became president, he has the same thought about contrasting us with the communists. So he makes religious freedom, not religion, not Christianity, but religious freedom, an important point of contrast with the communists. We are defending the right to follow the precepts and the example that God has set for us. We are defending the right of people to gather together across this land in churches such as this one, for the danger that threatens us in the world today is utterly and totally opposed to those things. Communist movement is based on a fierce and terrible fanaticism. It denies the existence of God, and wherever it can, stamps out the worship of God. There was while he was president, they issued a postage stamp that was based on four clergymen. It was called the Immortal Chaplains, who were on a ship that was downed, torpedoed, and went down. And it was called the Immortal Chapels, Interfaith in Action. That was the postage stamp. And Truman also, for the first time, had a Jewish rabbi come and give a prayer at his inauguration. So various ways he's doing this. And then you have Eisenhower, who, in degree rarely acknowledged, is really a key figure in defining the role of faith and religious freedom. It was during the Eisenhower years that Congress added the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, and "In God We Trust" to our paper currency. "In God We Trust" replaced "E Pluribus Unum" as our national motto. A lot of different things he did, but it was interesting. He did not cast this as a Christian crusade. He actually articulated this new pluralistic approach in a variety of ways. Right before he was sworn in, he was explaining that he thought our rights came from the Creator. And the way he put it is, our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith. And I don't care what it is. With us, of course, it's the Judeo-Christian concept, but it must be a religion that all men are created equal. But some people mock this "I don't care what it is" line. As one critic put it, Eisenhower seems to be a very fervent believer in a very vague religion. But in his own way, he captured the way most Americans were increasingly approaching faith, which was a combination of passion and tolerance. I think Eisenhower understood that if you were going to have all this extra God talk, it actually required a parallel emphasis on pluralism, which he did. The last religious group I want to mention in this drama is Jehovah's Witnesses. It's interesting right now as we watch the catastrophe in Ukraine that just a couple weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, they were severely called out by UN Human Rights Commission for their infringements on religious freedom. And their infringements on religious freedom were imprisoning Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. Well, we did the same thing for quite a long time. The brutality against Jehovah's Witnesses is unbelievable in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And look at West Virginia, the Jehovah's Witnesses were roped together like cattle at 2-foot intervals, forced to drink castor oil. In Nebraska, 2 men appeared at the home of a witness named Albert Walkenhorst, and they got him to come outside, took him to the woods and castrated him and said, that'll hold you for a while. And in Little Rock, Arkansas, a group armed with pipes and guns and screwdrivers beat all the witnesses they could find. And a guy named Robert Fisher was brought out, told to salute the flag. And he said, that is against my religious beliefs. And they just kept smashing his head against a flag draped car hood over and over and over again. From 1933 to 1951, there were 18,866 arrests of Jehovah's Witnesses. on very often for refusing to salute the flag, but sometimes for proselytizing. And the key thing that really makes them important in our history is that they decided to sue. They decided they looked at the First Amendment and said, that's supposed to be helping us. Why is it not helping us? We're going to bring court cases. They brought court case after court case. And many of the breakthrough cases that actually took the First Amendment and said, wait, we have this 14th Amendment. This is supposed to be applying this to the states now, came from Jehovah's Witness cases. And so over time, starting in the 40s and then accelerating with a number of cases that happened in the 1960s, they eventually did say that the First Amendment applies not just to the federal government, but to the state government and throughout the land. And that's why we have controversies over, prayer in school and creches on City Hall lawn and things like that. Because the combination of the First Amendment plus the 14th Amendment plus these court cases finally brought it down to that level. Now, the one thing I wanted to add about these court cases as we get to modern times is at a certain point around the 1960s, you stop. It's not just about persecution, it's also about accommodation. You have a lot of these cases of like, well, what happens if there's a secular law, but it infringes someone's religious, it conflicts with their religious beliefs, a draft, but it conflicts with the Quakers' pacifism. And in the first couple of hundred years, the view of the government, of most governments, was tough. It was the secular law. We're not doing it to pick on Quakers. That's just the way it is. But starting in the 20th century, a new doctrine develops called accommodation, which is actually, if religious freedom is to really be meaningful, we need to bend over backwards to accommodate people. So make it so that you don't need to force people to choose between their beliefs and the law. So a lot of the toughest cases that we deal with now fall in that category. And then the last thing I would say that really kind of cements this is immigration. Throughout this period, throughout all of this history, immigration plays a really important role. A lot of why the attacks on Catholics eventually faded away is there's a lot of Catholics, and they became the largest denomination in America, and they exerted political power. And the 1965 Immigration Act ends up being one of the most important bills in American history as it relates to religious freedom, because it leads to a wave of non-Christian religions coming in. You had in the 1820s, the top 10 countries sending immigrants to the US were all Christian nations. That was true up to the 1960s. But from 1986 to 2012, 3 of the top 5 countries sending immigrants, China, India, and Vietnam, were majority non-Christian. So 25% of the immigrants are not Christian. So you have the pluralism that Madison is hoping for is getting reinforced by immigration. So that's the long march. So, it's like saying we never look at the Declaration of Independence and say, oh, all men created equal. That gave Black Americans freedom. We know that's not what happened, right? It established certain principles that then Americans could point to say, we are not as a nation living up to that. And that's what happened in a sense with religious freedom. These incredibly important and novel principles were established in the First Amendment, but then Americans, often it's regular Americans who feel that their religious journeys are being encumbered, step up and say, this Constitution is not actually being enforced in a way that allows my spiritual journey and my spiritual freedom to flourish. So in all, we have this system that separation of church and state doesn't quite capture it all. I would say it's the notion that religious freedom is a right, not a favor granted by a king or a ruler or even an indulgent majority, that the state must not favor one religion over another. And that's true whether the government is the Congress or a local school board. That the majority religion does not get to regulate or push around minority religions. that people define for themselves what a religion is and whether it speaks to them, that the religions are largely left to govern themselves, that religious expressions by public officials are welcomed, but must be inclusive, ideally, and that our society must make special accommodations for the religious, that we allow believers to sidestep certain laws that would force them to violate their consciences. And that totality is, I think, the kind of mix, plus this the on the ground pluralism. That is why we've ended up with the system of religious freedom that, as I said at the beginning, I think is one of America's greatest inventions. So why don't I stop there, and I've talked a little bit too long, but I would love to take some questions.
Sam, you need to undo my video. Anyway, there we go. Thank you. So thank you so much, Steven. It really is amazing, the depth of knowledge and the challenges that we really have had in terms of having religious freedom. We have a couple of questions that people have put in, so I'm going to ask you to sort of rapid fire, think about this as rapid fire because we're up against our time. So a couple people asked, when you ran through the various persecution, there wasn't a lot about the persecution against Jewish people. Can you put that in context from the start to where we are?
Yeah. Well, there definitely was persecution of Jewish people when, in the colonies, I think 9 of the 13 colonies banned Jews from holding office, for instance, along with Catholics. And there was not as much persecution, strangely enough, as much persecution against Jews as there was against Catholics, because they viewed Catholics as a bigger threat. But starting in the 20th century, when Jewish immigration really picked up, then you saw the anti-Semitism and attacks on Jews grow. So the worst period was actually not in the 1600s so much as in the 1920s, 1930s. And it really was quite significant, and you would see it in, covenants in houses, in neighborhoods banning Jews. And it was really the World War II period that started to break that down. It was partly the reasons I said. It was also partly the recognition of what happened in the Holocaust and the birth of the State of Israel that led Protestant Catholic leaders to embrace Judaism as a part of the Judeo-Christian, trio, and started to erode the kind of discrimination against Jews.
Fascinating. Now let's see if we can put 2 of these together, because we're, time is marching. So can you tell us a little bit about what sparked your passion? And as you look at this, the First Amendment was applied only at the federal level, but even at the federal level, how did they square with having a chaplain in Congress, holding church service in the Capitol? So tell us about your passion and tell us about the apparent incongruity with regard to the behavior in the initial period.
Yeah, boy, those are, well, on the second point first, you're right. There were all these inconsistencies. Part of the answer is that there's no such thing as the founding fathers believing something. The founding fathers were a whole bunch of people, and they had different beliefs, and depending on, what the actual issue was and the decision that was being made, you would have, differences of opinion that led to inconsistencies. So Jefferson, who is, this ardent proponent of separation of church and state, had no problem going to church services held in the House of Representatives. So they would make distinctions of, I think the distinction that they would make, like about chaplains, it has to do with favoring one religion over another. They would allow, many of them argued that you could have religious depictions or religious voices as long as you weren't preferring one religion over another. In terms of my own interest in this, it was a few things. When I was running BeliefNet, which is a multi-faith religion website, I would get emails every day from conservatives, from liberals, all of them quoting the founding fathers to prove whatever it was they wanted to say. One day it would be to prove one thing, the next day it would be a different founding father quote to prove the exact opposite point. And I guess I like, well, they both can't be right. What actually happened? I wanted to know. I figured someone was misusing these founding father quotes, but I wanted to kind of get to the bottom journalistically of what had actually happened. And that was really what drove me to do these books. That's what drove me to do the first book, Founding Faith. What drove me to do the second book, Sacred Liberty, was I had this gnawing feeling that I had made a big mistake in the first book. And the big mistake was that I kind of implied that the fight over religious freedom ended with the ratification of the First Amendment, that it was really all about, and in fact, that's not true. It was so much of it had to do with these courageous Americans who fought to make it real.
So can you say something about Muslims and the issues that are there now?
Yeah, in Sacred Liberty, I actually argue in the final chapter that what we were seeing, the attacks on Muslims during the Trump administration, represented one of the most significant threats to religious freedom that we'd had in a long time. There were a lot of similarities between the attacks on Muslims and the attacks on Mormons and Catholics in earlier periods. They would say this isn't a legitimate religion, so it doesn't need the protection of the First Amendment. That was a common thing. So you may remember that in addition to the ban on Muslim immigration, Trump proposed having a registry of Muslims where all American Muslims would have to register. And I thought it was a wonderful moment when the head of the Anti-Defamation League, a Jewish group, said, if this becomes law that we're going to start registering Muslims, I, as a Jew, will register as a Muslim. Because he understood that that was such a threat to the core notions of religious freedom in America.
Well, Steven, we have so many more questions, but we are trying to be respectful of your time and the time of our speakers. And so let me just encourage all of you to read the book. Many of these issues are taken up in this book, and then maybe we'll have some follow-up. It is, really wonderful to have you here. And someone said, the clarity of your presentation and the ability to put forward information about our history that is not commonly shared, but needs to be known, is remarkable. And for that, we are extremely grateful. We're so grateful that you've taken the time to be with us and to share your information. Thank you. We thank you to all of our participants who are with us. And we want to encourage you to look ahead. Next Friday, we have a forum on the environmental decade. You might wonder when that was, but we're talking about Congress, Nixon, and the birth of the Environmental Protection Agency, featuring Bob Bostic, the curator for the Nixon Presidential Library and former head speechwriter for the administrator of the EPA. He will detail the history of the environmental decade and its seminal impact on policy and politics in the United States. We are having our first in-person and virtual simultaneous event to celebrate the bicentennial of Ulysses S. Grant. If you have ever wondered who is the guy on the horse over by the reflecting pool, that is Ulysses Grant. And that memorial is going to celebrate its centennial. It has been redone, and we will have Senator Roy Blunt, the architect of the Capitol, Brett Blanton, who has overseen the restoration of the memorial, and award-winning author Ron White, who wrote The American Ulysses. We will be gathering outdoors at the monument, so please plan to come and join us. We look forward to having the opportunity to see you in person. But if you're a virtual person, we will also be live streaming. And coming up on Thursday, May 12th, is the next in this series about amendments, looking at the First Amendment and freedom of the press, Thursday, May 12th at noon. As always, we remind you that these seminars, webinars are only available because of the support of members and donors to the United States Capitol Historical Society. We are a nonprofit organization that operates exclusively on contributions. Thank you for your help. Thank you for your support. Thank you, Steven, for an incredible presentation. We're delighted to have you with us. Be well. Have a good day all. Goodbye.